When did the medieval ages begin? Part 6, I think. Let's get into it. History textbooks say that the medieval ages began in 476. Up to this point in this conversation, we've been discussing alternatives to that date, primarily from the author Henry Pirenne in his book Muhammad and Charlemagne. He argues that the medieval ages actually began closer to the year 800 when the collapse of the trade system around the Mediterranean was complete or had started to really impact Western Europe. And that impact was caused by the Arabic tribes and their invasion starting in the 630s. It was more complete by the 730s, and so most of the Mediterranean was no longer open to the Western world, and therefore they had to use land as a currency. And this is where you get the concept of feudalism, which again uses that land as a bargaining chip for lords and vassals, and it creates the vassal-lord relationship tied to land, because trade was no longer a international constant the way it had been before. And today I want to read another book by a man named Charles Oman, and he lived around the same time as Henry Pirenne, and he is countering that argument that in fact 476 is a good date to pick for medieval ages because it has a significant split from the past. Before I go too much, let's read the section and then we'll discuss. And I quote, "It has often been repeated of late years that this date, 476, does not form a very notable landmark in the history of the world, that its sole event was the transfer of the nominal supremacy of the Western world from a powerless Caesar who lived at Ravenna to a powerless Caesar who lived at Constantinople. We reminded that the patrician Odoacer and the deputies of the Roman Senate assured the Eastern Emperor not that they had cast off allegiance to the imperial name, but that Italy no longer needed a separate Augustus, and that a single ruler might once more rule East and West, as in the days of Constantine and Theodosius. In a purely formal way, all this is true. As yet nobody in either of the three countries, Europe, Asia, or Africa, had asserted that the Roman Empire had died out and been replaced for all purposes by a Teutonic kingship. Documents were still dated and coins still struck with the name of a Roman emperor upon them, alike in Spain, Africa, and Italy. The disappearance of the Roman Empire of the West was in truth a long process, which began as early as 411 when Britain, the first of the Occidental dioceses, was abandoned to the barbarian, and did not, perhaps, end till Francis XI of Austria laid down the title of emperor in the year 1806. Yet, if we must choose a point at which, rather than at any other, we are to put the breach between the old and the new, if we must select any year as the dividing line between ancient history and the Middle Ages, it is impossible to choose a better date than 476. Down to the day on which Flavius Odoacer deposed Augustulus, there was always at Rome or Ravenna a prince who represented a clear heritage, the imperial succession that descended from Octavian and Trajan and Constantine. His crown might be fragile, his life in constant danger, his word might be less powerful in Italy than that of some barbarian Ricimer or Gundobad who stood behind the throne. Nevertheless, he was brought into real contact with his subject and was a visible, tangible personage whose will and character still made difference in the governance of the state. The weakest Glycerius or Olybrius never sank into being a mere puppet, like an 8th century king of the Franks, or a 17th century Cado. Moreover, there was still the last a possibility, even perchance a probability, that there would arise some strong emperor who would free himself from the power of his German prime minister. Majorian nearly succeeded in doing so, and the stories of the falls of the Goths, Gaius and Asper in the east show that such an attempt was not a hopeless undertaking. When Odoacer seized the throne from the boy Augustulus, it became with the consent, if not the goodwill, of the Constantinopolitan Caesar, the sole representative in the west of the imperial system, a very grave change took place in the status of the empire. Flavius Odoacer was something far more than a patrician ruling as a representative of an absentee emperor. He was not only the successor of Ricimer, but the predecessor of Theodoric and Alboin. For beside being a Roman official, he was a German king, raised on the shield and hailed as Theoden by the whole Teutonic court, who now represented the old legions of the West. But it shows that Oman is saying that yes, on paper, if you look just at the technical facts, men like Pirenne can make an argument that there is a difference between the Germanic kings and the old way, that there wasn't enough of a difference though. This difference was so marginal that one could argue on a formal technical paper level that the Roman Empire did not end. And he said you can use that formal argument to say that you can go from Augustus all the way to the end of the Holy Roman Empire in 1806, when Napoleon deposed of the last Holy Roman Emperor. And he said you can use that formal argument to explain that nothing had changed officially. The title could be passed on over and over and over again along this very complicated tree. And we see this in other cultures. That's kind of what Egypt did. Egypt has the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, the New Kingdom, and we see dozens of dynasties fall along this path, but it all remained Egyptian. Whether they were a Nubian on the throne, whether the Egyptian on the throne, whether it's a Hyksos on the throne, if the Hyksos were actually what some people said they were, it's still up for debate. There's this lots of ethnic difference between these pharaohs, and whether they were pharaoh or not, that's only the term for a specific period in Egyptian history. It's still the Egyptian dynasties. They're still part of the same political system almost. And that's basically what he's saying, is that you could technically on the formal paper make that argument. But he's saying that's not the best argument. The best argument is that while they still hailed the Caesar in Constantinople and they still minted coins with his picture, they still used his dating, that the fundamental difference had started by 476 with Odiace. That difference is so paramount, it has to be a breaking point. That there has to be a significant historiographical point saying, all right, from this point on, from Odiacer on, we now see kings once again in Italy, and they're no longer of the Latin persuasion. We had Latin kings a long time ago before the Roman Republic, but this time we now have an external king, Odiacer, who is not Latin. He is of Germanic tribal descent, and he is now hailing himself king. And so what he's saying is that that concept, that breakaway, has to be recognized. It has to be put as a point of difference between the old world, where you had this continuity of Roman emperors, Roman Caesars in Rome or Ravenna. Now we have an entirely different being, type of ruler in Rome again, and that would not stop. You would go from Odiacer, and then you had Theodoric, who would take it from him. This is when you have the Ostrogothic kingdom start, and the Ostrogoths would then fade, and the Lombards would come in, and the Lombards would fade when the Franks conquered them. And this would be a continual cycle. And then you'd have the Pope was the ruler of Italy of different small sections, and then you have city-states, and it just becomes this whole thing. But never again would a Caesar rule the western part than the eastern part. So that is Oman's argument, and it is a counter to men like Pirenne. If you watch the whole thing and you want to let me know which theory do you think is better. Do you think Pirenne's counter argument is better and that 800 should be the better time we put based off of trade and the ending of the Mediterranean world? Or do you think the traditional date argued by Oman is better, and that 476 with the fall of the last Latin emperor is better? Put in the comments below. Thanks.